exciting things to discuss. So with no further ado, I'll hand it back over to the senator so we can start our discussion.
Great. So I want to start before we get into the specifics of the draft recommendations. I just want to start by saying that I think the working group has done a great job of identifying issues. And what is clear to me, and I think I can speak for Representative Leeper, we've had a number of meetings, the chairs over the last few weeks with a variety of people, and really, I think, comprehend what a mammoth task this is to really, if we're going to really do the work that we've been charged with to get to a place where we've not just improved indoor air quality, but that we can say as a state we have great indoor air quality in every school in the state of Connecticut. And I think that's the goal. I think that's where we all want to be. And we're fortunate because we have a working group where every single person who's here is invested in that. And so we don't have any disagreement about where we want to be, which is a great starting point. But I think we have a huge task before us. And so for Representative Leeper and I think before we get into the recommendations that you've already seen in that Google Doc, and I know there's another set of recommendations, a refined set of those same recommendations that the coalition is going to put forward today and ask us to discuss. I just want you to know Representative Leeper and I have had our own discussions and I think have come up with a set of priorities of recommendations that might head us in the right direction. The second point I want to make, and we're going to present those to you today and we'll screen share so you can see them and then we'll get them out to all of you. And I should say that I really appreciate the help from John Moran, who stayed with us late last night and then continued to work on them. So we have something in writing to present to you. It's a very rough draft. The second thing I want to say is that after speaking to some of the stakeholders, and really, I would say if there are, I don't really think there are sides to this issue. So I hate to use that term because I really, in this case, believe everybody is trying to get to the same place, but maybe different constituencies that they represent. But having talked to like major constituencies, I think everyone has come to the conclusion that we don't have enough time to do the kind of work, between now and Tuesday that we would to produce a report and recommendations that I think would go far enough and be deep enough and have enough consensus around. And we would prefer to get to that place. So Representative Leeper and I are recommending that that we have a set of recommendations we bring to the legislative session. There is a bill that we co-introduced in the education department, and hopefully there will be a title written there or a bill, a vote to draft on a bill that will get us to the point of having recommendations this session. But I think the top of the list of our recommendations is that we continue the work of this group, the working group, for another year. And that we do so with very specific charge to address issues that we haven't yet gotten to that were part of the legislation last year. And that we add some additional areas that we think would be fruitful for moving us toward better indoor air quality in our schools. So that would be one of our recommendations, but I sort of wanted to say to you all that we don't think there's enough time to conclude even that much work by next Tuesday. So we plan to go to our legislative leaders and ask for an extension on this work for another several weeks to give us the time to put forward our recommendations, see how people, especially the agencies who would be responsible for implementing these recommendations, should they be adopted by the legislature. So we have enough time for everybody to really weigh in and make these the best possible recommendations they can be before we put them before the legislature. So our first step would be to say that we cancel our meeting on Tuesday and set that back a couple of weeks so that people have a little more time. And that would give us all time too to collaborate a little bit more and refine the things that are before us. And I think that still gives us enough, we still will meet any deadlines we might have to have a bill this session. So that's where Jen and I, Representative Leeper and I are coming from for today's meeting. And I think after we go through the recommendations discussion, then we should have a discussion about this timeline that I just suggested and see if people agree that this is a good approach. And by the way, if we extend the work of this working group for another year, I think it will not just allow us to do, take on some of the areas that we haven't even touched on, or certainly refine the areas where we need more consensus. It would potentially give us more opportunity to involve other experts in the field, other members of the public, and really have buy-in from a broader group than just a working group. Maybe other legislators who have a particular interest in this. So if we had another year to do this work, I think we could actually come to a point next year where we'd have a very solid report with buy-in from a broader group of people. So that's the thinking that Representative Leeper and I have. With that, I do want to say, I think it would make sense for us to start with the priority recommendations that Representative Leeper and I have discussed. And we will get you this in writing, but for now, Cameron, if you could share the screen, it should be in an email that we received this morning from John. And by the way, John, thank you so much for turning this around so quickly, because literally we met with him until late in the evening yesterday. And you did a terrific job of capturing our thinking and putting it into words on paper. I think that I do want to start by saying these are our top line ideas, but recommendations, but it doesn't preclude us adopting more of the recommendations if we can reach consensus in the next couple of weeks from the coalition. I think that there are a lot of ideas that the coalition has put forward that would fit well with these top line recommendations. So what we did, just to sort of set the stage for you, is we went back and really thought about what we tried to accomplish in the implementer last year, and the priority we all put on this first item, the inspections and evaluation, which we've been referring loosely to as assessment reports. In the statute, they are described as inspection and evaluation. The word reports is used in some places as well. And right now we have a deadline that every school district in the state it's mandatory that they have completed this by January 1st, 2024. We've heard from professionals in the field and from, including the technicians themselves who would perform this work through, mass contribution, but also, from the school administrators. From a lot of you have said that this deadline would be extremely difficult to meet. And I don't think we're really lined up to meet that deadline. So our first recommendation is that we move that deadline back to January 1st, 2025, which would give us more time to, refine the assessment, position schools to be able to do it, and make sure that we're getting the product we want out of the assessments. We also think that DAS should have a process by which they could issue waivers of the deadline, either due to a lack of licensed, professionals to perform all of these inspections, or it's possible they may have already completed the assessment under the existing law, because we know some schools may have applied for the grant money to do the assessments this year. Other schools may already have seen the statutory requirement and begun to engage on that. So a waiver would be there for any school district that has already completed the assessment, or if they have a similar inspection that was done with maybe slightly different format, but it's deemed essentially equivalent to what our requirements are under the statute. So that would be the first point. The second point is to require by June 30th, DAS, and I will add in conjunction with folks in this working group, but that you develop a prescribed form for all districts to use, because we think if it's going to be possible for an analysis to be done, a comparison to set priorities for where we need to start fixing or installing HVAC systems, that it's much easier to do that. I think it's only possible to do that if we have a uniform report. And then thirdly, we believe that the grant program that was in the budget last year of $150 million, we were happy to hear it reported that school districts could utilize that to pay for the inspection and the evaluations, this assessment report. We're not sure that districts realized that, and we think that there should be a grant program again with outreach to districts, so they know that this has to be done by, if we adopt these recommendations or if the legislature adopts them, has to be done by 2025, and that there's an appropriate deadline to make applications for that. And our thought is, for this particular piece, I want to be clear that we're talking just about these assessment reports, that we incentivize it dramatically, because we think it's the only way we as a state are going to have a statewide picture of what's needed. And so we would recommend that the reimbursement rate to a district to complete this be no less than 70%. We know that the grant, and Noel can correct me or us if we're wrong, but we believe that the grant program that currently was in place required the district match according to the school construction formula. And we know in some cases that might be more than 70%, it might be 79%. We are not suggesting it be less than what they would have gotten under that formula, but there are a lot of school districts that have a reimbursement rate much lower than that. And we want to incentivize the districts to do this work so we can really perform overall audit. And then the second point of our recommendation relates back to these reports, but we believe there needs to be a coordination and analysis of the reports that are submitted, and we believe DAS would need additional personnel to do this. So we recommended an additional position be created within DAS to coordinate and analyze the reports, and also analyze districts, identify districts that have not complied or are not positioned to comply by the deadline, so that we have some sense of where we need to focus just to get the original report done. I don't know if one position is the right number. It may be that DAS would say to us, that's not going to work. We need 2 or 3 people. I think we're looking for guidance from you on what would actually work to position DAS to manage this work, because I think we envision it as really the key to having a long-term plan for how we get to the point where every school in the state has an HVAC system that works. The third point that we are recommending is that we establish in statute the optimal temperature range of 65 to 80, and that we clarify that Connecticut general statutes currently require businesses to maintain indoor air temperatures no colder than 65 degrees, and that applies to the schools. This is one point where I think we overlap with the coalition's recommendation, but I think we also want a little more discussion about whether that's the right range. So we're not inflexible on this issue. And I do want to assure everyone that this is about establishing an optimal temperature range. It's not about making it mandatory. It doesn't say that every school will maintain that temperature range, but it is something that we think would be good to have as guideposts for a district to understand, from what we've heard from the science of all of this, that the only way to really truly, that one of the important foundations for improving indoor air quality is to have an optimal temperature range consistently to protect the students, the staff, and actually make sure the buildings are not growing mold and doing other bad things. So that was our third recommendation. And then the fourth is to continue, and this is what I mentioned, to continue the working group for another year require the group to consider all the items that were addressed in the original statute, but we have not gotten to yet, to continue the new HVAC program that was created in Public Act 22-118, which is the program that DAS administered. We didn't put a number on that, but we hope, and we think it should, we hope we all agree that it should continue, that it moved us in a good direction in this first tranche, but that there were some issues about, people getting enough notice about this was really geared toward schools that already had projects ready to launch. And we didn't want to, as Noel described, I think helpfully, we didn't want to lose the opportunity to get those projects done, and they needed to be done, go through that process quickly. But we also know in order to get to the next level, we need to continue a program that will reimburse districts for standalone HVAC projects, which aren't normally covered under current school construction legislation. And we think that we as a group should also talk about and consider the reimbursement of these projects. So if there's a way to incentivize districts to participate in the grant program and to act, take on these projects. And the reason we say that is we know that districts have a lot of priorities about how they are using their funds today, in that wide range of everything from maintaining school infrastructure, but also dealing with all the other issues they have before them, particularly after the pandemic. So incentivizing it might get a few more projects up and running in districts. And then the third item would be to consider also developing statutory requirements at the state level to make sure that when HVAC systems are installed, that they're properly maintained to ensure they continue to function. And this comes, there may be other work in other states that we want to look at on how they've done that effectively, but also it comes from the understanding that if a HVAC system, a great HVAC system may have been put in 10 years ago by a district, but if it hasn't been maintained properly, it's not going to be able to function as it should to really protect the air. And then there's a question about, well, did we invest foolishly because we spent a lot of money putting something in and then it wasn't taken care of, so now it's not working again. So I think those are our 4 areas of recommendations that we would like the working group to consider. And as I said, we're open to discussion on these 4, and that's part of what we'll do today. But if we extend that deadline for a couple of weeks, it'll give us an opportunity to talk to more of you, not just be in our own heads about what we've observed from the last several months, but also talk to more of you about how you would fashion these, or why you would agree or why you might not agree with what we laid out. I do think the next step would be to hear from the coalition. And before I do that, I think there's a little bit of confusion in my mind, because we had that document that we sent out to all of you, a Google Doc. And some of you, especially Ivan, I think I haven't had a chance to really review everything, but I know Ivan, you put some good work in on this and adding your comments, and I think there are others who may have as well. But I also think, from the coalition, there may be another approach. So I guess I'd like to turn it over to Lou now, since we have had some conversation, if you would share where you are as a group, or CEA is, in terms of moving to the next steps.
Sure. I'm happy to talk, just to respond to what you're saying. I mean, I think that everything that you put forward today makes a lot of sense. If the chairs and the rest of the members of the working group agree that it would make sense to move forward with some set of interim recommendations in the short term, consensus recommendations, whatever those might be, so that we can continue to work on the final report. I think it behooves us not to rush that process. I am of the opinion, and I've shared that with both of the chairs, that that final report really should be comprehensive deep dive into all the issues that we're talking about. And frankly, I'm a little bit relieved because I think this gives us the opportunity to do the due diligence that we really need to do on some of the issues that we just haven't fleshed out in great detail, whether it be how the green cleaning law interacts here, the school idling law, pesticides, et cetera. Some of the other discussions that we've been having. So I'm supportive of what you're proposing. I can surely share the recommendations that CEA submitted to the chairs, if is that what you'd like us to do, Senator?
Sorry, I muted. I think it would be helpful if you did that, if Cameron would allow, either Cameron can share them because you sent them to us last night. So I have it in my email, or I'm sure it's in his email, or you can, but if you could, these are just a list of recommendations similar to the list we just showed you. And yeah. I think if I see that there's some comments in the chat, and I do want to, like I mentioned, that Ivan really put in some work on making comments on the document. So I do want to say that Ivan, hopefully it makes sense to have Lou go through what is already in the report in some way, in the end of that report that we shared in the Google Doc, have you go through what your comments, where you stand right now, Lou, and then Ivan, I would want to give you time to sort of address the comments to the group that you had already put into the report, and any additional comments you might want to make. And Noel, I want to make sure that I think our agencies have a wealth of knowledge about what already exists and what you've already tried and where you see this going. And I want to make sure that I feel like sometimes we haven't gotten enough of that. And this is not criticism of you guys, because you guys are really busy and you've got a lot on your plates, but I think we could do better if we knew from you guys, sort of how you view these recommendations and where you think we're headed in the right direction. So with that, why don't we go ahead to Lou, and then Ivan, if you're okay with it, you can, I don't know what your time frame is like, but if you have time, then you would go next. Does that sound good?
That works for me.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Lou.
Thank you, Senator. So I think the first thing that you'll notice is that this is a version of some of the recommendations that were included in the end of that document. Those were some coalition priorities that we included. Some of them were more fleshed out than others. Some of them were just bullets. But the one thing I just want to say about this before I go into it is that we submitted these as our kind of exhaustive list of recommendations for the final report prior to us knowing that about the plans about moving forward with a separate interim set of recommendations. So I think some of these will probably work for that first set of recommendations. Some of them, I think we're amenable to kind of tabling them for further discussion and inclusion in the final report. But the first piece being comprehensive indoor air quality management plan for each school district that includes a designated indoor air quality coordinator to oversee and implement the plan, schedule of conducting routine assessments of school HVAC systems, including the low-cost school inspection, i.e. the Tools for Schools program, the foundation of a district-wide indoor air quality monitoring program, including a process for submitting, reviewing, and addressing complaints, and written protocols that would be accessible to the public and the staff to address those complaints. Providing training to individuals who'd be involved in carrying out various aspects of the management plan. I think that's pretty straightforward, including administrators, teachers, school maintenance personnel, local health departments, et cetera. Requiring the low-cost Tools for Schools walkthrough inspection annually, which is currently required once every 3 years. It's formerly required once every 5 years. The legislation that passed this year moved it up to 3 years. We were asked to weigh in on that. We think it makes a lot of sense to do that once annually. And that'll obviously be much easier once we have some standardization of the inspection forms. Establishing guidelines and standards, both for new construction, whether that be the high performance building standards, LEED, whatever the appropriate standards to go in place there would be, as well as any type of protocols for renovations and maintenance that are happening during the school year that may create potential inhalation hazards and contribute to air quality issues. The optimal indoor temperature and humidity ranges. We offer a little bit of discussion. Actually, what you see here under regarding optimal indoor temperature and humidity ranges, I pulled that out of the working group draft report just to help kind of inform this conversation a little bit. You can see that there have been a number of different ways of approaching this, but generally speaking, the low end of the optimal temperature guideline should be somewhere between 63 and 65 degrees, depending on the time of year, the time of day. The high end of that should be between 78 and 80 degrees, based on some of the best practices and kind of other approaches that we've seen around the country. Cameron, if you wouldn't mind scrolling down. Thank you, sir. Do appreciate that. Standardizing reporting requirements for schools and developing templates for inspections. So I think that's one that kind of overlaps with what the chairs have recommended already. Requiring school districts to work in conjunction with Department of Administrative Services, Department of Public Health, whatever is appropriate for that. We can certainly continue to discuss this and flesh this out so that we get a good product that we can all agree on for the final report. Requiring school facilities HVAC systems to comply with the most recent version of ASHRAE Standard 62.1 for indoor air quality and temperature, and to be able to keep those systems in operation continually around the clock. That's an important part to make sure that those systems are operating properly. Requiring that schools take necessary corrective actions identified through the schedule of routine inspections, both to supply clean indoor air for staff and students and to provide an HVAC system that's capable of maintaining those optimal indoor temperature and humidity ranges. And then finally, to allow for standalone HVAC installations, remediation, and upgrades to be reimbursed under the existing school construction bonding program. So that would be moving forward beyond the grant program that you all are talking about to make sure that 5, 10, 15 years down the road, schools are able to access funding, reimbursement for routine HVAC upgrades and replacement once those systems go out of service. So those are, that's essentially the full list of recommendations that we'd like to put forward at this time.
Do you want to address the extreme school heat emergencies, or do you want to hold on that?
I'm happy to. I mean, I'll very briefly, because I know we have limited time, and it seems like this is probably the type of thing. It seems like we're not quite at consensus on this issue yet. I understand there's some concerns. I read through some of the comments on the document. I would just simply point out that this is part of the charge of the working group, and once again, in the spirit of making sure that report is really a comprehensive standalone document. I think we would be remiss if we left out some discussion about how to approach this issue. And so I think, developing those protocols, on a local basis in conjunction with the Department of Public Health, the local health department, makes a lot of sense. We're supportive of prioritizing steps that keep students in class, whether it be moving folks around, employing window fans, that kind of thing, provided that those measures can be taken to safely and effectively reduce the temperature of the learning environment. I just have to say, moving students around, that's something that we already do. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to us once we're above that 80-degree threshold to move students from a classroom that's, 90 degrees to 83 degrees. there's, still, concerns about that. And so we have said that it makes sense. We think it makes a lot of sense to model any type of temporary closure procedures on existing practice related to emergency snow days. And we've also said that in the event that this has to happen, that we should allow the district to provide some of the instruction through remote instruction program, and just as we would during a normal snow day. And some folks followed back up. Chloanne reported back to us after she'd done some research that we would not be able to meet the minimum 180-day school day requirement through virtual instruction. So we recognize that there's some questions there. But that said, we also recognize that the way that a number of school districts currently handle their snow day schedule is that they will schedule 185 days or 190 days to the school year so that they have room to work with. And if they do end up canceling days, then they will just, or if they don't end up taking snow days, then they can just cut those days off of the calendar at the end of the year. We think that makes a lot of sense. And then, so that would essentially be the gist of our position on the extreme school heat emergencies. Happy to continue working through this with you all so that we can get to the right place on this issue.
Great. So now, Cameron, if you'll put us back in, great. Ivan, and I apologize. I haven't been able to read through all your comments, so that I'm interested in how now that you see this, it may change some of your views. I think your views may have informed some of this. So, but if you could give us your takeaways on this.
Well, I just want to mention too that, so all the agencies I think are still kind of working on formulating their response, and the comments that I made, those are just very kind of brief comments that I made after that I was able to kind of make, in a little spare time I had on Friday after the meeting. But, it's not like our complete comments either. And we're still like internally at DPH as well. We're also kind of reviewing, what we want to say, kind of internally a little bit more, before we kind of put everything out there. So, I mean, I guess, even on Friday, it seems like a while ago, because since then we've kind of, I've created a few different versions of kind of our responses, and we changed our process into like an Excel spreadsheet, which I can kind of peek at kind of while we're doing this. But so, I think some of the things that I had mentioned just kind of go back to what we were kind of discussing throughout the work group. We had some issues with kind of having kind of the action level kind of cut off. So, and, as well as like carbon, for monitoring, as well as like carbon dioxide, like some of the issues we'd raised before with that. So there, some concerns about what this would mean on the ground. There are definitely concerns through all this about, like who would be kind of in charge for enforcement and what like costs would be. And those are kind of, I think, more like agency wide. And I think Noel, it's probably better to speak on a lot of that, since DES was definitely tasked with a lot of work that would require substantial kind of investment on their end. And from our standpoint too, for like things like tools for schools. I mean, as we heard from before, Kenny Fosky was presenting, and as he used to be kind of like the coordinator for that for the state from DPH. But once that funding went away, we really haven't been able to kind of support that kind of work. So there are questions about that. I think we'd still kind of have to, a lot of it's a funding question, but we'd kind of have to kind of review what those would mean kind of long term. I think on the surface, I think mostly, I think we kind of probably support a lot of the kind of process things. I think there's, but not necessarily like the action kind of levels. I'm just kind of speaking off the top of my head without looking at the document, but, and, there are definitely areas like, I think we have to kind of think more about, like, so, we're talking about like extreme heat was kind of, I think that was kind of like a sub goal of kind of the task of setting temperature, humidity, and different kind of thresholds, and also of, was it the recommendation for to establish optimal kind of temperatures and so forth. And I think that one is an important point that I think we have to kind of think more about. As Anne mentioned, I think OSHA is kind of working on coming up with like a standard. There might be a little bit of differences for kids who have some slight different like considerations that we need to make. But I think things like that are good, but I think we need to think about it more as also like implementing more of like a heat plan that's maybe temperature triggered. So I think there are kind of different things that could work around with that. And I mean, there's a lot to comment on. I mean, really what I was kind of talking on Friday was really just a little teeny bit of that. I think for a lot of this, I think it makes more sense to kind of wait till we all have our official response, although we also have to kind of figure out, even now I'm having a little bit of a question of, do you still want us to respond completely to that original document, or should we now be kind of responding more to these kind of updated documents that we have the updated one that Lou was just kind of going over, and also the one that Senator Kushner that you were discussing in the very beginning, the kind of the 4 points. I think that a lot of these we kind of have to think about what these kind of really entail, what these mean, and are these more recommendations, or is there going to be like an enforcement side of it too? And trying to think of, I think also if we want to see like legislative action, I think if we kind of focus more on process at this point, it probably makes sense. But we're still kind of early. I mean, I don't think we've kind of determined exactly what the final goals are yet either.
I appreciate that. I think it's hard because we as a group haven't, because you just got all hit with this idea that we continue, first of all, that we postpone the deadline for voting on recommendations, the report and recommendations from next Tuesday to a few weeks out from now, and we'll try and get you that date pretty quickly. But then we've added to it a second step, which is that we postpone voting on the report portion of this and only look at the recommendations piece of it. And so I think if that's the case, if we're just our recommendation is that we postpone working on the report at this time and really focus on recommendations we could put forward for this legislative session. Some of them I think are kind of critical importance because continuing the working group for another year is sort of the threshold for being able to postpone voting on all the recommendations and all of the report. So I think if we have consensus on those two items, and maybe that should be the first part of this discussion, although, I do want to hear from everybody. It doesn't have to be the first part of this discussion, but the piece we have to get to is whether we have consensus or strong majority agreement that we would move the deadline from the 31st back a few weeks, and that we would focus our vote on recommendations for this session, with the understanding that we would continue the work of the group on the other areas. So I think that's sort of the threshold questions we have to get at today in order to move forward. But before we get to that, I'd like to hear from other people, like concerns, questions, thoughts about if we could focus mostly on the recommendations and hold off the discussion on the report. I think that would help us at this moment move quickly to come to some consensus. Matt.
Thank you, Senator. I for one strongly agree with moving the reporting and the vote back a few weeks to make sure that we could do something that's comprehensive and flesh out the recommendations. I would also add, maybe for consideration, that we have a progress report or an interim report that backs up the recommendations. There's been a lot of work already put into the draft report, And my idea would be to take out the sections of the draft report that deal specifically with the recommendations that we want to put forward, because that will help inform and give some background about why they're important and some of the reasoning behind them. I would like to say I put my own recommendations on the report yesterday afternoon, late afternoon. I've also emailed them to Cameron. If the chair would allow, I'd love to bring them up to table. Cameron, do you have that document?
I'm pulling it up right now.
Thank you.
And thank you. I'm sorry I didn't know that, and I apologize for that. I didn't realize.
Oh, it's quite all right. I emailed separately. I had just put what I'm going to talk about directly into the draft document Google Doc. I think just for clarity's sake, what Lou presented was CEA's recommendation, not specifically coalition recommendations, just for everybody's edification here. Although I think that they're in line with the same things that I'm saying and what the chairs have come up with their priorities. So I think that there is good consensus on these recommendations, but you'll see that what I talk about kind of hones it a little bit from what you were saying, Senator. Number one is to designate a department within the state of Connecticut to oversee receiving, compiling, and aggregating the data from the 5-year ventilation assessments. So I think it's important for everybody to remember that our current legislation has 2 components. It has that kind of tools for schools, which I call the 3-year, and there's the 5-year, the ventilation assessments. And so we should remember that those are distinct. I think that one of the shortcomings of the current legislation that I see is that we don't have a department that is going to accept all of this. Right now, it's the legislation says that the information has to be posted on individual websites of municipalities. I think that in order to make the most of this data and be able to analyze it and understand what the problem is, we need a department that's going to collect it. I think everyone agrees on that. I'm not convinced that DAS is necessarily the appropriate department to aggregate the data. I think maybe DPH would make more sense. DPH has had the tools for schools up until a while ago. They lost funding for that. I think that it might make sense for public health to have the information, although certainly DAS makes the most sense for distributing grant monies and that sort of thing, but they're not necessarily involved with the public health aspect of what the data represents. So for consideration, I would offer that maybe 2 departments would make sense for that. Number 2 on my list is to standardize the reporting requirements and format. And now I want to make it clear that this is for the ventilation assessments. Having every jurisdiction submit in the same format will streamline that data collection, make it more cost effective for someone who's putting it together. I also say that this information should be available for university and public health research. Again, stressing the need to have a designated department. Suggested forms and methods of procedure have been completed through my national organization, Tailored for Connecticut. So we're well on the way to having things to offer the group with templating and some standardized format. My 3rd recommendation is in line with CEA's recommendation that the 3-year testing requirements should be annual. I think that can be an important component of what we're doing here. Through various maneuvers, it's changed from 2 years to 3 years to 5, now back to 3 again. It used to be annually as of 2003. Best practices in science say that this should be done every year. The draft report lays out a very, very strong case about why annual walkthroughs at a low cost and low impact are really important. What they do is they're the canary in the coal mine for the 5-year ventilation assessments. They're a way to make sure that the maintenance is being performed properly. My larger recommendation is that we standardize forms for that. We have an ambiguous language that says, such as the Environmental Protection Agency's Indoor Air Quality Tools for Schools program. I think that the requirements and the reporting for this should be prescribed, that it's not jurisdictions you're out there by yourself, do something like Tools for Schools, say do Tools for Schools, or create something that they should do so that everybody does the same thing. There's a level playing field. It's not some jurisdictions doing some things and others doing different ones. Documentation of this, I would highly recommend be included as a requirement for the 5-year assessment. This would prevent jurisdictions having to submit every year to DPH or DAS or whoever's going to be in charge of the program. They need to maintain those records so that when they do the 5-year inspection, hey, give me your last 4 years worth of stuff when I go in there to test your system. And I include that in the 5-year report. I think that those can be consolidated because they do work together so well. I agree with changing the reporting deadlines very strongly. As a contractor who does this kind of work, I already know how many people are ringing my phone and how many engineering firms are going to be busy, how many technicians doing the work are going to be busy, how every school district should not, in my opinion, should not be required to comply at the same time. We have a 5-year reporting requirement, and I think it makes much more sense to have a continuous operation of this, where 20% of the state would be required in any 1 year to perform this, so that by the time you get to the end of the 5 years, everybody is there. And so a staggered rollout of this makes sense for all of the technicians performing the work, for the engineers creating the reports, for the funding in the jurisdictions. If a district has 5 schools, it's easier to spread the cost out with 1 school per year every 5 years, rather than get hit with 100% of it and then nothing for 4 years and then 100% of it. Doing that would also allow any grant program to not have 100% of the people trying for a small pot of money and then nothing for a few years and then everybody tries for the money again. It makes sense to me that this would, all of the reports that are coming in, it would lessen the load on whichever department is going to be administering the programs. So I wanted to throw that out there. It's a yes and for everything that I've heard to this point, and I thank you for your time.
Wow, thank you. And Cameron, if you can go back to the gallery view. Great. Yeah, I think that was super helpful. So now we have 3 documents, and the great thing is that there's a lot of overlap in approach. So I think that it gives everyone, I think a sort of comprehensive starting point. It would be helpful maybe now to move to the question that I put out there at the outset as to whether or not people agree that we should maybe start out with extend the deadline for any vote by several weeks. Is there anyone who's opposed to that? Maybe I should just say. Speak now or forever hold your peace. I feel like this is sort of like a wedding. Is everybody in agreement with that? Because if we start from that point of view, that really helps. So I see all the heads yes and thumbs up. So that's great. So right now, Cameron, we will, postpone the meeting. We'll cancel the meeting for the 27th, for the 31st, and we will schedule another meeting and let you know. But we're going to put it out. I think our intention is to move it out far enough that there's really time for more conversation and for everybody to really look at these 3 documents and the underlying report. So there's really 4 things you could be looking at. It will give us time as chairs to get your feedback, and maybe that way we could do some work on where these overlap like produce a document for that meeting that we would vote on a document that's like maybe pulled everything together. And I know we would appreciate the time to, make sure that John has the time to do that. And then the second step would be is there general agreement to continue the working group to address the things that we haven't addressed yet, to flesh out a final report, and to maybe consider some of the new things that we are recommending. Is there any disagreement with that? So I see Lou has his hand up.
No disagreement, just a point for clarification. So I just want to make sure my understanding is that the chairs are proposing to put forward a set of interim recommendations in the near term, and with
I wouldn't call them interim recommendations because I don't know what that means, but recommendations, that we would still have recommendations now, but that the work would continue for more recommendations and for the final report. I will say, you can't, one of the recommendations is that we have to have recommendations for the legislature if we intend to move the deadline on the, that has been suggested for the, from the 2024 to 2025 or to any date past that for the report. We have to have a recommendation to put to the legislature to extend the time of the working group. So I think all of these are our current recommendations, and with more to come is the way I would frame it. Other comments or thoughts? Do we have consensus then on that point? I see heads saying yes. So if that's the case, then I think, okay, great. I think we've seen the suggestion that everything, a folder be put together for a Google Drive folder so that all these documents can be shared with all of you for your review. And I think that, I'm sure that's doable since we've already taken the first step. Great. So we can do that. Are there any other comments that folks would like to make now before we adjourn? Because I really feel like the main thing is we want to give people time to talk to each other and to talk to us to refine these. And we don't have to do it today, but if there's anything that strikes you as like that you feel like it's important to say right now to get on the record, I also want to have that time for you. Jan.
Yeah, I just have a question. I did put some comments in the document. Would you like us all to continue to comment in that way? Yes, but could you then send an email to the group that you've done that? If everybody sends an email, I think it will help us then, not wait until, till a point down the road to look at those. We can do it a little more effectively. And I think that if you focus more on the parts of the report that relate to the recommendations, I think if we spend our time for the next 2 weeks really focused on the recommendations piece versus the report, that will help us, because I think the report could slow us down. If we're focused on fixing the report right now, I'm afraid we won't get enough consensus on the recommendations in time to have something for the legislature. And if we've all agreed that we're going to extend the process of the working group for another year, we'll have more time to work on the fine points of the report itself. Does that make sense, everybody? Great. Any other comments or questions? Representative Lieber, do you want to add your 2 cents? By the way, I got to say, working with Representative Lieber has been fabulous because she's so knowledgeable about what happens on the ground, much more than me, because I've never worked in a school, I've never been on a school board, I've never worked in SDE, and it's made a huge contribution to this process. Thank you.
That's very generous, Senator. Obviously, Senator Kushner's been a huge leader on this work long before this working group as well. So I am grateful that she paved the way for us all to get to this point. And it's really been just such a privilege to help support this work and ensure we get better air quality in our schools for our students and staff. I think we've got like a solid working place to continue from. I think it's nice to feel like we have some really substantive recommendations to go forward this legislative session. Still, of course, with some details to be worked out. And I think we have a nice plan to do that over the next couple of weeks. And it seems like there's a consensus that we're all grateful for an extra couple of weeks to continue that work. And then to know that some more substantive recommendations will still be forthcoming as we continue these conversations even beyond these initial recommendations. And I just want to thank Matt actually for, I thought, very clear and substantive recommendations today, and appreciate in particular like the annual walkthroughs. And I was wondering, and I don't know if we want to talk about this right now or if we want to have these conversations in the next couple of weeks, but whether or not you think those forms should be submitted to whichever agency we hopefully are able to designate a person to own this process annually, so that districts aren't trying to keep track of those 4 years worth of reports, not reports, but even just walk through forms, so that they'll be kind of the keeper of that information year over year. I just can imagine with staff turnovers and whatever might be happening within a school building, trying to make sure you're keeping on a hold of those forms could be difficult at the school level. I don't know. It's just wondering about that.
I think that schools should be responsible enough to keep the information that's required of them for as long as it's needed. I think that I don't want to overwhelm whatever department we're going to give a new task to. I don't want to say, hey, DAS is going to get 1,000 pages from every school every 5 years. I think that we could do this in a way that they get a synopsis, maybe, as opposed to every bit of data. That data is, however, important and valuable. So if there's a use for that data for public health, for example, then maybe DPH would want that information where DAS wants to know that you comply, not necessarily what the result for every single room within your facility is. So we don't want to overwhelm these people with paperwork every year, every school district. That's why my suggestion would be to include that with the 5-year ventilation assessment as an appendix and a checkbox that I would do to say, hey, did you give me your maintenance records for the last 4 years? And that being part of the report card that this ventilation assessment becomes. And that checkbox informs whether or not you qualify for the grant, or if you get an extra point toward your grade and the person who needs the usage the most. Just making sure you keep your grades up. If you're getting C's and all of a sudden you're getting an F, well then the enforcement mechanism needs to be there to say, hey, we gave you a bunch of money a while ago, how come your grades are slipping? That sort of thing.
That's really helpful. I appreciate you of sharing that detail. And one other thing I want to, and I Joni, do you want to talk about this in particular? Because if you do, feel free to jump in. Sorry, Senator, through you.
Yeah, I'll keep it quick. I was just gonna, it's funny, Ivan actually just kind of brought it to light, but I was gonna say even if we could create an electronic version where it's not necessarily DPH's maybe checking it, the schools are keeping track of it, but this way it's there to reference down the line, just in case there is a record of it. There's, it's more transparency. This way, if schools do lose it, they have a receipt or something once they've submitted those yearly reports.
Yeah, I do want to jump in though and say that I really think it's important that our really appreciate everything you've said, Matt, and that our department
Ivan, absolutely, everything needs to be electronic from now on because there's no other way to manage data and it's not efficient to do it any other way. So hopefully everyone can do that. We can set it up from the outset like that. I also want to suggest that we look at, I know John Moran has been looking at other practices in other states, especially for the part that you were outlining then about making sure people are maintaining and staying on top of this. Because we're giving them money, there should be some accountability for making sure that we didn't just waste the money because they didn't maintain the investment properly. And so I think we should, gather some other information. We can do that over the year. I don't think we have to have that done by the time we make these recommendations. I think it would be really important for DPH and DAS to talk about what's been said and share with us. And that's not to rule out SDE and DEEP and DCP if there's a role they want to weigh in where they think it overlaps with their work. Obviously, we want to hear from them, but I think a lot of this work is currently done by DPH and DAS. And so figuring out how we would coordinate that and move that forward, I think would be important. I know that when we worked on this last year and folks from the agencies and from the coalition will remember that there was a proposal last year that the inspections, the tools for schools inspections or tools for schools like inspections would be done annually. And I think there was resistance to that from the administration. I suspect it was for the reason Ivan is mentioning, that there wasn't funding for it. And so if we don't have funding to do this, if we can't provide the funding to do it, then I don't know that it's going to work. And so I think the issue of these are some budget issues that need to be looked into quickly. We're all going to be, it's a budget year, we're going to be taking up these issues. So it is the appropriate time. So there's some big asks here that I think we're anticipating, funding for a new department, or we set it as a new position in DAS, but I take your point, Matt, that maybe this is a new department that coordinates between DPH and maybe it should be in DPH, maybe it should be in DAS, or maybe one of its functions is to coordinate between those. And then we've also looked at the cost for administering the tools for schools that used to be funded through DPH. And I think we need a lot more information on that as well. So there are some real challenges here because there's some money associated with. One thing I really like, though, about the working group taking this up is that, I've heard from the governor and from the governor's office, he doesn't like to spend money on things without having data points that, direct us to show that this is a need or a priority. And I don't think we're going to get that data points unless we implement some of these programs. And so I do think that it's aligned with the governor's general thinking and philosophy about how we as a state spend money. But we just have to make sure we're thinking about, not just legislatively what we're going to put forward, which is super important because we are an important part of the budget process, but also, where the governor sees this going through the agencies as well. So hopefully we have a few weeks to try and all get on the same page. I think Michael Morrow has his hand up.
Good afternoon, Senator. How are you?
Well, how are you?
Very good, thank you. I fully agree with Matt. This is regards to a full department being implemented for this because of the amount of paperwork that it's going to generate. I think that more than one position would be needed to be added and let that department deal with the DPH and the DAS in whichever manner they need to. I think as a taxpayer, I would say that taxpayers would not be against creating something like this for the safety of our schools.
I appreciate that. And I think you're absolutely right. I will tell you that I'm a taxpayer too, we all are, but also I have the advantage of having just personally talked to, many, I don't want to say thousands because that's probably an exaggeration, but hundreds of people, constituents in the district. And I talked about this issue a lot because it's been it's been a front issue for me for a while. And universally, people in our districts want good air quality in our schools. And it's
it's an issue that spans urban, suburban, rural. It really is of interest to families in every part of our state. So I really appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Anybody else for today? Representative Leaper.
Thanks, Senator. I just have one more question. I would love for the brain power of this working group to be thinking through in the next couple of weeks. I think we all agree we can't have every single district rushing to the contractors all at the same time to be doing these evaluations or to be doing the actual school construction work of improving the HVAC in our schools. So thinking through how we structure a rolling process. I know, Matt, you said like 20%, but which 20%? Who decides part of that first 20%? I think that piece still needs to be ironed out. And I do think there is a lot of agreement that we don't want everyone at the same time. Not only will that not happen because we just don't have the capacity in the state for that, but also I think we worry that it drives up prices for all the districts who are doing the work because we're driving up demand without supply. And we don't want to do that to our districts either, artificially make this work more expensive. So how we can structure this rolling process, I think would be really helpful. And of course, getting all of these assessments back will be a big part of that, because hopefully we'll learn that 35% of the state actually has already done this work. So they maybe don't need to be a part of this process going forward, at least not seeking grants to do the HVAC improvements, et cetera. But maybe we have some districts who have not even started. And so how do we identify those and make those districts and schools a part of the initial 20%, let's just say. So anyways, these are just things I think that we've been thinking about, and I'd love to tap into your thoughts and expertise on how we could best structure that.
And I think that's great. That's terrific, because I had a little note, the same question about where do we start? How do we decide where we start? I think that is really important. Also, I think that there's information that DPH and DAS already have. They already have some of this information. I did pay attention to what you sent a few weeks ago, and there was a link to a survey that the DPH has, like it's a more recent analysis of reporting that needs to be done. I haven't delved into it, but I suspect there's some information in there that would help guide us. So having more time to look at that may help inform how we start the program. Matt, you have your hand up.
Thank you. I agree that it's a tough challenge to try and figure out how we're going to do a 20% per year over 5 years. One of the things that I thought about, and I wanted to kind of put it out there as an idea first and see if there was support for it before I delved a lot into trying to flush it out. One of the things that I thought about was potentially a staggered reimbursement, with a higher reimbursement for year 1 going down to year 5. So if you put it off, then you get less money. And kind of saying, okay, well, here's where it's going to be required, or something along those lines. In New York City, they have to do building evaluations and benchmarking, and they tie it to the last digit of their tax ID number. So I don't know if there's some sort of number that's assigned to every school in Connecticut. There's some identifying factor that way that we would be able to do it with. So that's a 10-year program. So we could say anything that ends in a 1 or a 2 is going to get done year 1, 3 and 4 is year 2, so on and so forth, as a way to break them apart. But we need some way to have a identifying characteristic that's unique, some sort of numbering sequence for the schools in order to be able to just divide by 5.
Great, a lot to think about. Thank you. And again, it would be really helpful if the folks who have worked with these schools for the last, long time, DPH and DAS could think about some of these ideas or come up with different ones that would help inform us. I see Noel put his camera back on. You want to say something?
Just to comment on that. I mean, we completely agree. We met as the executive branch the other day, and we completely agree that we want to, in order to make these meaningful, the recommendations that we're coming up with, we have to really think them all through because especially at DAS, we're where the rubber meets the road. And we get we're on the bad end of an awful lot of ideas that get thrown at us. And, I had more questions and my team had more questions than we had answers once we read through the initial recommendations. And we all thought they were great, but at the same time, we're like, well, how do we implement these? So there's a lot of work and a lot of coordination to go through just on the executive branch, because we're the ones that will have to actually implement them. So we would love to comment, but we really need time to actually think it through. It's a lot.
That's great. I think if people could focus again for the next meeting and really communicate with us between now and the next meeting. Let's not wait for the next meeting. If people can communicate with each other or with us, with the chairs, where, what you think we could have consensus on for when we vote, that would really help us shape this so that we can get somewhere at the next meeting. I think the fact that we've all agreed in this meeting that we want to continue the work, continue the working group for another year, that really helps us because it gives us some time to continue, hopefully reaching more consensus. But if there are consensus items that we have right now, let's get those done and move them forward. So to the extent that you all can look at the recommendations portion of this with an eye to the maximum number of recommendations we can adopt this year in statute. And that would be really helpful.
Yeah, if the team, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I was finished.
Well, if the team, like we talked about changing up our recommendations today, and there were a lot of overlap. So if we could come to consensus about what exactly we want to work on over the next couple of weeks, I think that would really help us focus. So if we could have a new draft report or a new draft recommendation letter sent out to the committee, then I'll put it to my team and we'll organize the rest of the executive branch to like get together and really analyze it and come up with some sort of plan and what exists, what doesn't exist, what can we do this session versus what can we do next session. We can get that done pretty quickly because we do things so quickly. But we will completely focus and respond as quickly as we can.
I think maybe toward that. And what if Representative Leeper and myself and John, I want you to weigh in on this too. What if we try and take a stab at harmonizing the documents that are out there now so that everybody's dealing with one document instead of three?
That would be fabulous.
Okay.
I literally just texted you that, Senator.
Look at my phone yet, but that's great. So we'll take that responsibility and try and get that done as quickly as possible. I know, John, you're a big part of that. So because John does the magic after we talk things through. If you think that's doable, John, with what you have, and if we need to have a little more conversation with you, Representative Leeper and I will be available to you as soon as you need our help.
Okay, that sounds good.
Great. I see Lou has his hand up.
No, I was just thinking that one way to approach this that might be extremely helpful would be to put together like a dot poll or something like that. Like if we were to condense all of the recommendations that we've received so far into a chart and give every one of the working group members, 5 votes or something along those lines to select their top priorities, you would quickly see which ones are consensus items because, or if there are consensus items, because everyone will vote for those. And then that'll also help us kind of sort out what are some of the other kind of top line priorities as we prepare to move forward. So that's just a thought.
Yeah, let us think about that a little bit. I don't know if that would, I don't want to, I don't know how I feel about that. Need to think about it a little more, but we'll definitely take it into consideration.
We're not quite at the voting point yet though either, right? So I think we all have to kind of comment first before we can vote. One thing that might be helpful that I thought you were kind of going to go in the direction of is maybe some of this could maybe distilled maybe better with like a shared Excel document or something, just because that way we can, if there is overlap, you can kind of put it in the same area where it's like, the cells are kind of connected to, it's kind of how I had envisioned, or how I worked with things with this, just because like it's kind of difficult to distill when the recommendations are kind of all in different pages in different areas. But if we kind of have everything kind of connected together, I think that way people can also add comments, and we can see kind of who kind of owns each comment, like which agency or which kind of group. But that's all.
Yeah, and Ivan, I would invite you to work with us on that, in formatting that. I think the first step is for John and Rep. Leeper and myself to harmonize the recommendations. And then I think that will make it, how we format that to facilitate input. I think you could be helpful in that area. I like working in Excel also. But then the last thing I think I guess my hesitation was what you just said, Ivan. I'm not sure that if people had to vote tomorrow, we might not have as much consensus as we would have if they saw that prioritization, Lou, as a vote, then we might not reach as much consensus as we might be able to do in a couple of weeks through a little more discussion. And I really encourage you all to talk to each other too. And we'll certainly be seeking you out over the next couple of weeks. Or if you want to talk to us, just, shoot us a note or ask Cameron to set up a call. We can certainly do that. Cameron, did you have something you wanted to share?
I just wanted to say that people should be able to see each other's comments on the document as it is now, and specifically see who made which comments. Just in case yours isn't loading, you can just put your name at the start or end of your comments, just because I've seen one person who's have been anonymous edits. So just as an FYI to everyone, that can help with organization.
Yeah, although I think we do want to consider if there's another approach that will work better for folks by doing it in a Google Sheet instead of a Google Doc. That might be helpful. Great. All right. If there are no other comments, we will get a notice out as quickly as possible. Number one, we'll work on a document. Number two, we'll get a notice out as quickly as possible about the next meeting date. And we really appreciate everybody, your time and effort that you put into this thus far, and appreciate your desire to continue working on it. Nobody said, oh, no, I don't want to be part of this anymore. Or if you did, you're just going to wait until it's later. Go ahead, Representative Leeper.
Just wanted to confirm, do we want anyone continuing to make edits in that other document, or should people hold on to their comments until we get one compiled list of recommendations, and then edits could go in the recommendations document? Because I don't want anyone duplicating work by putting comments in two places. So I think it's the latter. Is that correct, Senator? We will be getting you new recommendations?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Hold up until you get the new ones, and then we'll all be working from one document. Great. I don't see any other hands at this time, so we will adjourn today's meeting and look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. Thanks so much.
Have a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.